Hello and welcome to episode 114 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Omeleth.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. So today I thought we could explore the line between developer and admin. We touched on it briefly on our last Hot Takes episode, where Andy, you talked about not wanting to self-host things because you don't feel competent at that. And we kind of continued that conversation afterwards because, Amaleth, you do self-host quite a lot of stuff. You are much more of an admin than Andy, for example. So what do you consider yourself? Do you consider yourself a sysadmin or a developer or both?
I don't know. I consider myself whatever I need to be. If what I'm doing is administration, I'm an admin. And the same goes for development.
Just depends what day it is.
Yeah. And the same for front end versus back end. Some people focus on one. I find myself doing all of it, probably a little bit poorly.
And it's not that I don't do admin stuff. It's just that I feel terrible. Like you find me today feeling terrible because my domain name for my home Nextcloud server has disappeared, and I'm desperately registering domains and figuring out what DNS is. And it's just stress for me. I don't enjoy it at all. It's just a thing that needs doing.
I think I've been worried by being a developer. You see how tools are made. You see how everything is put together. And that terrifies me when I look at software, which you generally think of as like good, bug-free, secure software. And so I find myself a lot of times looking at software, I'm like, oh, I'm pretty sure I know how this was implemented, or like what kind of dragons lay underneath here.
When I encounter an issue in some sort of commercial service, I love guessing at what sort of technical thing on the back end caused it.
I found myself doing that with games a lot recently, where I'll be like, what was the developer thinking? Like, what's their through line that they used to put this together? And sometimes you can even find like these little like, oh, I find this is just based off of X. And you can, gamify and, try to increase X, whatever that may be.
So Andy, let's try to get to the bottom of this. You love messing with code, but you don't like messing with computers, seemingly. Why?
Sometimes I like messing with computers, but the thing is, I think I like making things and I like feeling happy that they work and they're done. So when I write code, either because I've structured the code in a way that feels right or because I've got tests that check that it works properly, I can get to the end of that process and feel like I've made a thing that works and I'm happy with it. Maybe even confident in it in some, like not that confident, but a bit confident. But when I configure something, I have no clue whether I've done it right. And I don't know how to check really. So I've set up, at one point I was running a proper mail server and I got so scared I now run a kind of not really proper mail server. But when I set up my mail server, I could check that emails got sent, but I had no idea who else could send emails through my email server. And I did not enjoy that feeling at all.
Sounds like what you need is a TDA. Test-driven administration.
Yes, that would be awesome.
That would be cool.
Well, isn't that what monitoring is all about?
That's just another thing you have to admin, though, and set up.
Yeah.
Monitoring is not quite the same as testing, though, because the service can be up, but the functionality not work necessarily, unless your monitoring involves testing the functionality of the thing.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Like if we could have monitoring that actually checked things properly work, that would really help. And especially check that things didn't have security holes, which is kind of a never-ending problem.
One service I really love is Conversations Compliance Tester. Conversations being the XMPP Android client. They have a compliance testing thing. You create an account on your server, give the credentials to the service, and it will log in and run through a whole battery of tests to see what the server not only supports, but whether it is working as intended. That feels like end-to-end integration testing, kind of.
That's really good. I actually am feeling a little bit better about my life because I recently set up a Gatus monitoring system for some of my home systems and my websites. So now I have slightly more confidence that they're at least up, if not working correctly.
There's various tools out there too that will do some of the like smoke testing or whatever. Just the initial, am I getting a 200 return from this web service? Like there's stuff out there that will do that. However, there's a term that I've started trying to coin at my day job called green light engineering, which is where you do enough work that the green light comes on, like the network connection happens, you get the up signal. But beyond that, it's really hard to tell, like, is it really up? What's it doing underneath the hood? Is it just brute forcing its way to correct? So that last mile is where I find, like, that's the part that terrifies me about just regular administrations. There's just so much to know there. Yeah, sure, it's up. The green light is on. But is it really production ready?
That worries me about development as well. Like everything.
Yep.
It looks like it's working, but is it actually?
I think, though, with development, though, it's easier, air quotes, to introspect under the hood, whether that be something as simple as like printf debugging or attaching to GDB or LLDB, one of your debuggers, and looking at it and stepping through code and stepping through the output. Like, it just feels like that is easier to do on a code level. And that might just be because that's what I do for a living. So that's what I'm comfortable looking at versus like the system, the operating system, all the stuff working together in cohort. That to me is kind of terrifying.
I guess we should be asking Amleth how you deal with the uncertainty that I'm describing. Or maybe you don't have that uncertainty because you're more on top of how things actually work.
He runs Arch, so...
Yeah, it never updates it.
That means I have no idea how anything's working.
Or whether it's working.
Exactly, because it's always the latest code. Who knows what bugs are in there?
You mean who knows what bugs were fixed? That's what the latest
Also
code means.
Do you just have a YOLO attitude to adminning and development?
That's what I was trying to think through. I do think I do, to a certain extent. I kind of YOLO my way to the point where I can do those rigorous tests on my end and see, is it working how it's intended? Do the many pieces fit together how I want them to?
I tend to focus on the security aspect, but there's some decently simple ways to cut off, a large majority of the concerns, right? If your threat model is not local execution of something, right? Firewalling things off, making sure things are properly separated is a good way to like make sure you're mostly okay, and then you can YOLO certain aspects to an extent.
I think one of the things that mitigates some of those anxieties with self-hosting is trying to approach the administration and configuration the right way. I found this blog post earlier today called The 6 Dumbest Ideas in Computer Security or something like that. And it's all about these broad overarching anti-patterns that we see. The article says in development, but I also see those in administration. I see them everywhere, like the default permit model. Everyone can get in and you have to enumerate the badness you don't want to get in. That is a route to very bad things happening on your server. So default deny and enumerate the good things that you want to allow in, and a separation of privilege, all those kinds of things. Those adages are very real and important, I think.
So yeah, I do think part of what's going on with me is that I don't really know what I'm doing. And somehow I managed to get to a point where I felt like I slightly knew what I was doing with programming, and I have no clue what I'm doing with adminning. And that's a me thing, right? But some like wisdom like that would be a way of improving that and moving on.
And while those adages seem helpful, you do have to know how to implement the ideas. Like, how do you implement the default deny in a system? There are many different ways. You could use NF tables, IP tables, or UFW, or those are just firewall examples. You could do that in the reverse proxy layer. Who knows? There are tons of different ways. And I completely get where you're coming from, that it's almost like there's that paralysis of choice with not only what to do, but where do you even start?
And for that too, you have to load up all the context of the actual system. Like, is it running IP tables? Is it running NF tables? Is it running UFW and, IP tables underneath, like firewall D? All of those different things, and knowing how those pieces fit together. And we may have mentioned it in a previous episode, but in some of the Linux distributions, that's sometimes the feeling that I get, which is subjective, and I don't even think it's accurate, but how you can have a system that you put together and entirely from start to finish. And then there are other ones where the distribution made all the choices, and you have to kind of trust that all their little pieces fit together because they have the context of the whole system.
I think I found a good analogy. You get to know a particular server distribution the same way you get to know a language, its syntax, what's available in its libraries, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I do think it's easier, for me at least, to feel like I understand to some extent what's going on down to quite a low level of detail when I'm writing a piece of code than when I'm setting up a piece of software where I know there are millions of lines of code underneath that I'm not going to read, that I'm never going to understand. Now, obviously, it's an illusion in both cases, right? Like, I don't understand the code I'm using when I'm writing a program either, but it's easier to feel like you're in control of what's going on.
Yeah, I wonder if that has something to do with, just documentation in general, right? When you see run this command to start this thing, it may not explain what all the different arguments are or why you're running that command. And on the flip side, even if it did, sometimes that's not necessarily relevant to the task at hand, or it'd be too difficult to explain all those various branches all the way down. But I think you're right. It's almost like an abstraction on top, and you have to know how deep to go.
I will say, I think things got a bit better for me when I started doing infrastructure as code a little bit more, because part of my problem with adminning stuff was that I would set things up and then forget what I'd done, or worry that I was going to forget what I'd done. And I would keep notes, but then I wasn't sure that I would remember them or understand them. And so the more I can turn into code, the more happy I am doing that job.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think a large majority of some of the things that I worry about are because I don't feel like I understand how it works under the hood. So when you see somebody like, oh yeah, you just tweak these commands and then you're good. And you're like, all right, well, there's no way for me to reference that versus just writing it down myself. So I really like that infrastructure as code, or like anything that you can kind of turn more into code. And that's probably too why we tend to bias ourselves towards things like scripts. Because again, it's code. It's something we're comfortable with. It's deterministic to an extent.
The word used to be DevOps for that sort of thing, right? And that kind of is where I thought we would go with this, because surely the line between development and administration is DevOps, isn't it?
I never understood what DevOps was, other than pretending you didn't need ops people because suddenly devs knew enough to do everything, which was always completely wrong, obviously.
I think it had to do with that, and maybe a little bit of, it was, obviously trying to smush those two things together. You had developers being able to do some ops stuff, but then you also had ops stuff doing things as developers, IAC and whatnot.
Isn't it just doing operations with a development mindset? Like deploying infrastructure using a developer mindset of scripts and code rather than manually shelling in and running commands.
Right. If it was that, I could get behind it.
It is that, and it's also the infrastructure as code piece, right? Managing it in a central version control repository. And there are benefits to this in that you can have all of your entire team, the developers, the operations people, all using a centralized code base or centralized tooling. So there's a lot of benefits, and I can see why companies would move to more of a DevOps thing. And then you have other spinoffs like DevSecOps, where you can even integrate the security pieces into that. And it's a visual representation, right? Like you can go through the code and see what mitigations are being applied. But there is still the aspect of like development, and there is still the aspect of operations. And I have yet to see a company kind of just do really, really good at the like DevOps as it was meant to be, and not just developers are now operations people are now developers. Now have at it.
How much automation and orchestration do you use, Amleth?
Almost none. I might have a couple scripts here and there for updating things, but just about everything is SSH into the box, run the commands I need, exit.
Is that a scale thing?
Yeah. Everything I run is extremely small scale, so doing it that way is very easy. But I also find that I don't necessarily need to write scripts for everything. Some things I do so infrequently, it's like once a year, I'd spend more time writing the automation than I would doing the thing.
So then that's my question then, is how on earth do you remember what you were doing a year ago so you can do something that makes sense a year later?
I write it down.
And most of the time that thing has changed a year anyway, so.
Mm-hmm.
I agree though, like sometimes those things that happen very infrequently, it is kind of a drag to have to write down the script in order to do the thing, which that alone is going to probably lead me down a rabbit hole of wanting to test the script and, all kinds of other stuff. And I believe there's an XKCD comic about this exactly, where the time it takes to write the script is way longer than just doing the thing.
Mm-hmm.
However, I've also found like that it is generally helpful a year later if you have a script, even if it's not going to be run verbatim, you have that sort of like, oh, that's right, this is how this goes. And you can start to encode like the edge cases in there and, other concerns while keeping in mind scope creep.
I think like Andy mentioned in a previous episode, scripts are also documentation in that they're just a list of commands to run.
They can be. It depends on how you write the bash.
What about your personal development workstations, your computer? Do you use any sort of Ansible or anything like that to set those up, or do you do that manually?
I do all that manually too. If I need to reinstall my Arch desktop tomorrow, I have a lot of typing ahead of me.
So I got to age 47 with manual setting up of operating systems. And then this year I've done a load of Ansible and I feel so much better. And I can just get a new machine up and running and know that everything's right on it straight away.
I have some custom bash scripts called Baseline. I think it's even in my public GitHub that I use when I set up new machines. And it's effectively a bunch of bash functions with a TUI on top of it that, you just select these pieces and you're running this OS or whatever. And it's only meant to be for my laptops, my machines. So this is not something like generically that anyone could use. I mean, they're welcome to it if they want, but I typically use that, or I'll even just pull out like individual functions from there because you can just source the file and run the function. So I do that when I set up machines. I haven't ever migrated over to like a full Ansible setup or something fully declarative. And I think it's probably because I use that a lot at work. So I don't know. I don't want to use it at home. I have no idea.
I forgot a big part of the story. I do very much use .file automation. I use a .file manager called Chez Moi, and it handles different config files across different machines, fonts, dynamically swapping between themes. That is where my automation is. In terms of like application and system setup, nothing is automated, but user space config everywhere.
I just do an rsync, man. I just rsync the entire home directory, all .files and everything.
But there's too much crap in my .files directories.
But that's what being a Linux user for a long time is all about. It's having like .file craft.
It's really interesting, Amalith, that you find that that's the bit that you automate, the .file stuff, because that's the bit that I've found I did intend to automate it, but I didn't get round to it because I just end up copying my home directory. And the bit that I feel better about because it's automated is partly just installing a list of services, but also they've then got specific configuration or commands that needs running, or there's something that I installed from some random location and I want to be able to recreate that. I get really worried I'm so worried, aren't I? I am just a very worried person. But like if I downloaded a tarball and unzipped it in /opt, that just brings me out in hives, right? But if that's in my Ansible file, I'm fine.
It's interesting to make that split between .files and programs, because now that I think about it as well, like all of my scripts and things that I have to set up a machine, they just do the installation of the tool or the programs and services. I have my .files that I have separately, and those I'll copy in either by hand. I mean, I guess I could, use links and things, but I'll copy in the configuration separately because I have a lot of different machines. Like I'll have Fedora machines or an Ubuntu machine for work, and I will find that like one configuration for everything, or even trying to automate that in one set of Ansible, there's too many rough edges around there. So I find installing services is easy, but the configuration I want to do kind of by type of computer.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason for my not automating the .files. It turns out my different machines have different configurations and it would be too much of a hassle to kind of figure that out.
My machines mostly have the same environment, but small tweaks here and there, basically just for the monitor. Like my taskbar, I might put fewer icons on it on my laptop. My approach towards configuration and whatnot is also, I have my primary desktop. I haven't reinstalled it in, 5 years or something at this point. When I set other machines up, those are the new ones, and they're usually laptops, and I don't necessarily want all the applications on my desktop. That's a ton of crap, and my laptops don't have all that storage. So I sync the config files because those are small and text-based, and then I install the applications I need for that machine as I go. And if I don't need it, I never install it, and the configuration sits there and doesn't get used.
Something we've talked about on 2.5 Admins before is the idea that systems administration is essentially putting together pieces of software to make a system. And I don't understand how that is fundamentally different from putting lines of code together to make a piece of software. Isn't it fundamentally the same when you think about it?
I was thinking about that earlier, and I think I prefer systems administration because it feels a bit bigger than code. And I wonder whether Andy prefers code because it feels a bit smaller in scale than servers.
I think maybe, at least for me, it's the being able to load up the context. And granted, there's no way I'm going to load up all the context. If I open up the source to the Chromium browser, right? I'm not going to load up all that context ever. But I can segment that stuff off into manageable chunks, and I can load up the context that I feel that I need for that task. Whereas systems administration feels like that amount of context is almost unbounded, and there's just so many things to know and put together where, yes, it will all work, but I'm always like in the back of my mind, I'm like, is it though?
Yeah, I started thinking about, well, first I started thinking about the person who makes bricks versus the person who builds the wall. But then I started thinking, I thought that was a bit mean to programmers. So I'll go for the person who makes Lego bricks versus the person who builds Lego models, right? So the thing you want from your Lego brick is that it's exactly the right size and it's exactly the same as the other one. And the thing you want from your Lego model is that it's creative, it serves its purpose, it's beautiful, it brings together lots of different things. So yeah, I think you're right. I want a small thing that I can get my head around and feel like I've made something that feels, it's not going to be perfect, but something that feels perfect or right.
Is it about control as well? You are in complete control of the code base that you have written, if it's small enough and it's just you, I suppose.
I mean, once when I wrote my Spectrum programs, then yeah, but these days that is all an illusion, yeah.
But it's the illusion that you're okay with, and the illusion that Amalith is okay with is something different.
I was wondering actually what the skills are of a good developer versus a good sysadmin, and whether they cross over or they're completely different.
Well, a big part of it is documentation. No matter what you're doing, if you document what you are doing, you will then be able to go back and reference it.
Yeah.
And whether that is separate documentation files in whatever form they are, or comments in code potentially, or even as a sysadmin, you've got to put comments in your config files as well. Because if you don't, then you come back to it and be like, why did I set that variable that way? And you just have no idea in a year or 2 years.
Yeah, my feeling is that sysadmins are better at documentation, possibly because the human element is stronger in system administration.
You're saying that developers are not human?
I'm saying that documentation is for helping humans, and humans are more in the loop when a system is running than programmers are in the loop when a program is running, maybe. I don't know.
I think they're basically the same in terms of what skills are useful. You need to know how to talk to people, the people who are going to be running the stuff on your systems, or the people who are going to be using your code or contributing to the code or working on the systems along with you. You need to be able to see the forest for the trees and the trees, all of the individual trees, as well as the overall forest.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Do let us know where you are on that spectrum of developer and admin. show@linuxdevtime.com. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.